Hello, Rabbi Charney. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Okay.
Okay. All right. Shabbat Shalom. Is this Hector?
Shabbat Shalom.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, if I'm made co-host, that'll probably make things easier, and same for Rachel Cohen. At least when Shabbat is over, and then we can. I mean, Shabbat is already over for her, so if we're made co-hosts, that'll be great. And
I,
yeah,
I already did.
great. Thank you. Um, well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Rachel. And hopefully Rachel Cohen can also be made a co-host, and that way she'll be able to unmute herself as well. She's, as folks know, already in Chicago. Um, so she will be teaching us this afternoon, but first.
Okay, I already made a co-host.
Great, thank you. All right, well, welcome everyone. But first, Mincha would be a great coffee cup. We're going to begin Mincha this afternoon on page 214 in the Lev Shalem Sidor, 226 in the newer Sim Shalom, 558 in the older Sim Shalom. We begin seated. Ashrei Yoshvi Veitecha, Hod Hallelu Chasela, Ashrei Ha'am Shekach Lo, Ashrei Ha'am Shadonai Eloha, Tila LeDavid. Tehillah Adonai Yidabir Pi, V'varech Kol Basar Shem Kodesh Olam Va'ed, V'anachnu Nifarech Ya, Me'atav Yad Olam Hallelujah, U'Ba'al Tzion Goel Shavi Feshav Yaakov Ne'u Adonai. V'yatakadosh Yoshev Tehilot Yisrael, V'karazel Zev Yamar, Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech Kol Haaretz Kevodo. V'tisaini ruach v'shmacharai korash gadol, Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. Adonai lo le'olam va'ed. V'yiftechu b'cha yodehi shemecha, ki lo azavta nashech Adonai, Adonai chavetz leman tidko, yagdil Torah ve'yadir. So now is the time when we turn to the Torah service, which is the time for Torah study as we're gathered virtually. Begin in just a moment, reading from Parshat Behalotecha, which you can find in the Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 816. If you're following along in any other kind of a Tanakh and any other kind of a Hebrew Bible, you can find what we're reading at the beginning of chapter 8 in the book of Numbers, in the book of Bamidbar. Begin with a blessing, thanking God for the opportunity to study Torah with all of you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshtanu mitzotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe limor daber el Aaron V'amarta al elav V'alotecha el anirot el mul pnei hamenorah Yahiru shivat hanerot V'yahas kein Aaron el mul pnei hamenorah Ela neroteha gasher tziva Adonai et Moshe V'zeh maseh hamenorah miksha zahav Adirechach ad pirchach mikshahi Kamarei asher Adonai et Moshe Yenasa et hamenorah V'daber Adonai el Moshe limor קח את הלווים מתוך בני ישראל, ותיארת אותם, וכל תעשה להם לתורם, הזה עליהם מחטאת, והעבירו תר על כל בשרם, וכיבסו בגדיהם והיטהרו, ולקחו פר בן בקר, ומנחתו סולת ולבה שמן, ופר שני בן בקר תיקח לחטאת, והקרבת את הלווים לפני אוהל מועד, והקרבת את כל עדת בני ישראל, והקרבת את הלווים לפני אדוני, וסמכו בני ישראל את ידיהם על הלווים, והניף אהרון את הלווים תנופה לפני אדוני מאת בני ישראל, והיו לעבוד את עבודת הלווים יסמכו את ידיהם על ראש הברים, ועשה את האחד חטאת, ואת האחד עולה לאדוני לכפר על הלווים, ועמדת הלווים לפני אהרון ולפני בניו, ונפת אותם תנופה לאדוני, והבדלת את הלווים מתוך בני ישראל, והיו Halim. That is our first Aliyah B'Halotecha, which we read this coming Monday and Thursday and Shabbat Haba'ah, the Shabbat to come. Before we leave this Torah study and Torah service setting, I'll ask if there's anybody who's present who is commemorating a yahrzeit this week or the week to come, who wants me to say an El Malei Rachamim in honor of the deceased. It looks like we don't have anybody in particular here to say Kaddish this week for a loved one. So we'll move back into our service. We move out of the Torah service and into the Whispered Private Amidah. You can find it on page 223 or 234 or 574. It's recited privately and standing. Yai da dai 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 da dai dai dai. Yai da dai 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 da dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 da dai dai dai. Ya da dai da da dai dai dai. Yai da dai 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 ya da dai dai dai. Yai da dai dai yai da dai dai dai. Yai da dai dai yai da dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 ya da dai dai dai. Ya da dai da da dai dai dai. Yai da dai 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 ya da dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da dai 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 dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da 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 dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da dai 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 dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da 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 dai dai dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da dai 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 dai. Ya da dai 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 dai. Yai da dai dai dai. We continue with Aleinu, page 231, 248, 598. You can rise or remain standing. Aleinu l'shavech l'ton ha'kol l'tekdu l'hag l'yotzer b'reishit. Kakatu shortach Adonai mochelam v'hevenim arvei Adonai v'melcha kol haaretz v'emahu yihi Adonai echad u'shmo echad. Continue with Mourners Kaddish, page 232, 249, or 600. Yit gadal v'yit gadash shemei rabbah v'yama divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon u'vyomechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen Yehei shemei rabbah mevarach le'olam u'lamei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha berichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'yimru amen Yehei shlama rabbah min shemaya v'chaim alinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen Oseh shalom b'mramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Once again, it's a pleasure to anticipate learning Torah from our rabbinic intern, Rachel Cohen. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov, Rachel, where you are, and this is yours.
Thanks. Yes, yes, and yes. It's been so funny existing in the twilight zone across time zones of it being like still Shabbat feeling till I end Shabbat with you all, but also it's, totally dark outside right now. So hello, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So we will be looking at the parsha for the upcoming Shabbat, the Ha'alotecha. We get the laws of what's become known as Pesach Sheni, basically the second chance for offering the Pesach offering for the folks who didn't get to do it the first time around. So as we are looking at this tonight, one just, kind of parallel situation that's crossed my mind is as all of these, the COVID restrictions are loosening and people are starting to get back to shades of normalcy, I'm hearing more and more stories about people deciding, there was this life cycle event, for instance, that happened during COVID. We had a Zoom graduation party. We had a Zoom memorial. We had a Zoom, some way to mark some milestone. And then facing the decision, are we now, as people in some numbers can gather in person, are we going to have an extra or a second or some other shade of making up that thing that they missed in its, most most joyous form, or most, in the case of, events of mourning that have also been deeply impacted by COVID, there are people who feel that they missed really essential pieces of processing critical moments in their lives. So there's now more and more people who are facing, even a year later, saying, should we still have some kind of, while it may not be called a funeral if the person's already been buried, for instance, like what is this idea of second chances? I just see it kind of coming up in some ways that may feel parallel, may not really, depending on how we're understanding the situation. But I think it's just worth keeping that in mind as we consider these laws of Pesach Sheni that we will look at. Like, what does it mean to have a second chance for us in our world right now as things open up? All right, so for folks who have the source sheet, we will start at the top. For folks who don't have the source sheet, we will be beginning in what's Numbers chapter 9, verse 10. And just because I wanted to sort of keep things condensed on the sheet, I'll give you some background to this situation. Basically what happened is God gives Moshe the laws of the traditional, at the regular time, Passover offering, and saying, this is how you're supposed to do it. This is what you're supposed to say. This is what you're supposed to eat or not eat, and how you are supposed to be when you're offering it. And then some people in the community, rightfully so, come to Moshe and they say, well, we were in a state of impurity because we were near a dead body at the first time of the offering. So, that's like not cool or unfair, however you want to read between the lines, kind of, we should have a chance to do this too. So he says, interesting point. Let me take your case to God and we'll figure it out. And God ends up then delivering the instructions for what's become known as Pesach Sheni, a second chance 1 month later, past the original date of Pesach, to offer what's very similar, as we'll see, very similar, but with some differences, another Paschal lamb offering. So what we end up reading, again, this is Numbers 9, verse 10. So then what God says in response to Moshe, again, he says, he, she, they, God says, speak to the Israelite people saying, when any of you or of your posterity are defiled by a corpse or are on a long journey, meaning you're a far distance away from Jerusalem, since this was one of the pilgrimage festivals where you would have had to schlep yourself and some materials or money to obtain a sacrifice. So if you either have an impurity situation because of a dead body, or you've been, on a long journey away from Jerusalem, and it would be hard to get there. At the time when you would offer the Passover sacrifice to God, they shall offer it in the second month. The counting in this case, where Nisan, the month of Passover, would be the first month. Just to clarify. So you offer it in the second month on the 14th day of the month at twilight. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So sounds familiar. And they shall not leave any of it over until morning. Again, sounds familiar if you look back at the instructions for the original Passover offering. They shall not break a bone of it. They shall offer it in strict accord with the law of the Passover sacrifice. And if you look at the Hebrew, what that phrase is, kechol chukat haPesach ya'asu oto. So literally, with every law of the Pesach offering, they should do it. So you might expect, reading that literally every single instruction for the original Passover sacrifice would apply to the second one, which we'll see at least how it gets interpreted rabbinically doesn't end up exactly being the case. Okay, so that's what's described for people who have those kind of extenuating circumstances. And then it says, but if a man who is clean and not on a journey refrains from offering the Passover sacrifice, that person shall be cut off from his kin, for he did not present God's offering at its set time. That person shall bear their guilt. Okay, so in a nutshell, what it appears, at least in the Pshat from the Torah description of it, is that if you have seemingly a good reason that you couldn't have offered the original Passover sacrifice, you get this, extra permission, second chance. But as it describes at the end, if you kind of just didn't feel like it or didn't have what's considered here a good enough reason, then it doesn't apply to you. It's kind of like anybody who runs an organization kind of has to like follow these fine lines of saying like sometimes there are exceptions, but also we don't want people to misinterpret what we're saying as too lenient. So that's kind of, at least having been like a middle school teacher, that's kind of how I read that description. So anyway, so that's how we see it in the original text. I would say it already seems like it's implied that the people who were in a state of ritual impurity had a good reason that they couldn't offer the original Passover sacrifice. There's a comment from Sforno that I think emphasizes that aspect of it being a good reason. Is there anybody with the source sheet who would like to read Sforno's comment on Numbers 9-7? Backrax? I can't tell whose hand that is, actually. Whichever of you is raising your hand, go for it. Are they able to unmute?
I think that you can request to unmute.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks like we're not.
You're good now.
Can you hear me?
Oh, okay.
Can you hear us?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, good.
We are tamei by reason of a corpse. What would be restrained by not being allowed to being near the surface in its appointed time. Seeing that the ritual impropriety we have incurred has incurred in the process of our fulfilling a positive commandment. Why should the result of this be that it causes another transgression?
So great, thank you so much for bringing that Sforno to us. What he's adding, when they say that we got this ritual impurity for having done a positive commandment, what some of the other commentaries seem to agree is that it's either it was a relative of theirs who they were obligated to help bury, so they were doing a mitzvah to tend to this body, or it was like another person who didn't have family and they kind of jumped in to help tend to this person. So in either case, like a huge mitzvah, one of the things that people literally can't repay you for when you're helping to to tend to the body of someone who has recently died. So all the more so, I read Sforno's comment as just kind of really emphasizing these people, not only they had a decent reason, they were actively doing a mitzvah. So Hashem, why would you bar them from fulfilling another mitzvah because they were like doing a mitzvah? These are mitzvah loving people. You should really make another chance for them to do this other mitzvah. Okay, so obviously several generations pass in between both the biblical text we read and Sforno, and between Sforno and when we get to Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. But I want to read a couple selections from Maimonides, who ends up kind of showing how the halakha turned out, at least in his era, and also kind of clarifying some of these pieces of how is it different from the first Passover offering, and how is it similar to. So for one thing, just kind of building on this idea of like it being a mitzvah, he says, similarly, partaking of the second Paschal sacrifice on the 15th of the month of Iyar is a positive commandment, as stated, eat it with matzot and bitter herbs. So he's kind of saying, they didn't miss their chance. The second chance that's being offered isn't just make you feel good thing. It's also given the same status of like it being a positive commandment. So it seems like he's kind of saying that, it turns out that if you qualify for this exemption, you still get to fulfill a positive commandment, even though it's taking place at a different time. And then before we jump to the next text, there was something I realized I needed to do more research about before I could understand the piece of it that I put on the source sheet. So going back to the piece about, is somebody ritually impure? If they're ritually impure, they can't offer the first sacrifice. It turns out, according to Maimonides, it's not actually as black and white as the Torah description might suggest to us. So Maimonides says, if if it's a minority of the community who were in this state of ritual impurity because of being near somebody who had died, then Pesach Sheni applies to that minority of people. They get the exemption. But if it's actually a majority of the community that are in this state of ritual impurity, then he says they don't actually need to wait till Pesach Sheni. The people who are ritually pure and ritually impure offer the sacrifice one with the other, which I found really fascinating. And again, kind of made me think of our COVID reality. It's like if a few people have some extra, extraneous circumstances going on, then let's kind of craft an alternative experience for them that may suit whatever's going on. But when it's really, like the majority of people who are facing some, also think about what that would mean for the majority of the community to have been in that state of impurity because of, like it could have in fact been like a plague or some really significant tragedy in the community that would have left them in that state. And I think that I find it really like an act of kindness that's how he ends up ruling on that, because then the cohesion of the community is preserved, and it says, no, we're all kind of making this, let's call it hybrid, it's we're doing the original thing, but knowing that there's a lot of people who are in a state that wouldn't otherwise be like considered okay, but we're kind of going to make it work anyway. So I found that fascinating. Okay, so all that is background. Let's now look at what's the last source on the source sheet. Rambam's, the second Rambam piece, the last source on the sheet, Laws of the Pesach Offering, chapter 10, number 15. Is there anybody who would, it's kind of a chunk of English text, again, to make it all fit on one nice page. Is there anybody who'd like to read this last Rambam source? Okay, I'm happy to do it. What are the differences between the first Paschal sacrifice and the second Paschal sacrifice? At the time of the first, chametz is forbidden to be seen or possessed in one's domain. It may not be slaughtered while one is in possession of chametz. Its meat may not be removed from the company in which it was designated to be eaten. Hallel must be recited when it is eaten. A festive offering is brought with it. So that's what's called the chagiga, like an additional offering. It may be brought in a state of impurity if the majority of the people are impure because of contact with a human corpse, as we explained. So that was the background I was giving you beforehand. And then this is the part that, I found, I was very surprised to read this last piece that I have bolded on the source sheet if you have it. With regard to the second Paschal sacrifice, by contrast, both chametz and matzah may be possessed by the person at home. Hallel is not recited while partaking of it. It may be taken out of the company in which it was designated to be eaten. A festive offering is not brought with it, and it may not be brought in a state of impurity. So interestingly, on the impurity front, in some ways it's more black and white, that if you're going to be doing the Pesach Sheni second chance offering, you have to be in a state of purity. And I've described this kind of exception if there's a communal, upheaval for the first one. Yeah. Okay. But the part that surprised me at least was saying that that you can actually you could have just eaten a sandwich that was very, very leavened and, have lots of chametz at your house and then go offer your Pesach Sheni sacrifice. So, in contrast, if we go back to the original description, the Numbers 9, verse 12, they shall offer it in strict accord with the law of the Passover sacrifice. It's interesting that, again, this is at least Rambam's interpretation. To me, that seems like a major difference in the laws of the original Passover sacrifice. So at this point, I'd be curious to, get any thoughts about that. Marlies?
Oh, I just had a question.
Sure.
So when it says Hallel is recited, this is like pre-rabbinic, before Siddur type prayer Hallel, or what is that exactly?
I mean, I'm imagining this is like, again, something that if I like would love to look more into exactly when Rambam says Hallel, what is he referring to? But I'm presuming by Rambam's time, he's adding a layer onto it that isn't necessarily what he thought was happening in the biblical description. He's saying like, this is my, in rabbinic times, this is like how we would expect to see things. Granted, like the temple was not there, but there's a lot of rabbinic writing that kind of presumes that there could be another temple, or here's like how you would do it if the temple was standing. So I don't know exactly what text he's working from, but I'm presuming that it includes at least a chunk of what we would still call Hallel today. Cantor Torney, does that?
Yeah, I would have to check my source work, but I think that the Sidurim that we have the order of Hallel fixed for centuries before Rambam's time. Again, like worth double checking that, but the order of Hallel has been fixed for a long time. You're right. It is an interesting contrast because it is he's referring to a biblical set of customs, and Hallel is obviously rabbinic. So that's sharp of you, or at least to pick up on that. But that construct of something rabbinic is entirely made up of biblical passages. So those have existed for a long time, and I do think they were cobbled together in the order in which we find them today. By the time of Siddur Rav Amram, I think I will double check and get back to you on that, but I think they're pretty set in existence by his time.
Yeah. Super interesting question. And now I now have some more stuff to go look at. So Brant, yeah, at this point, I'm just kind of curious to get anyone's thoughts on like this contrast. Is it surprising to you that like these similarities, differences, other thoughts? Brant? Oh, yep.
Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that when you read this, that the last one is so inconsistent with the first one.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is that if you look at religion, the necessity for religion is communal participation, right? Communal participation. So you can't have that many exceptions, correct? Because otherwise, if everybody could have their own Pesach when they wanted it, there'd be no Pesach. Okay.
Right.
So the exceptions are very strictly construed. The thing about the impurity, there's discussion about that because people are actually in the community while they're impure.
Right.
But they're not in the community when they're traveling. So that one was not discussed, which is interesting to me because that prevents real practicality. So it appears to me that the latter one conflicts with the first one, but the part of it that is fascinating to me is that if you make it into a separate sort of like practice that's not as strict as the other one, then it's not as special as the other one either. So you don't lose the adherence to the special because you made it different. And the way I view all these things is the necessity of the continuation of the groupthink, the communal aspects of religion, which all religions need to survive. And that's what the modernity comments show you in contrast to the original text, that we have to structure this in such a way that it's not really the same thing that we want to preserve for the community.
Right. So really interesting point. It sounds like you're saying, Brant, while the Torah text is saying it's supposed to be, virtually the same thing, that these changes of not doing Hallel with it, of, it not being as special a state, you can, you don't have to clear your house out of chametz before you go do it. Like those, it makes it seem more special to still be with the, as many people as possible doing the first one. Great point. Other thoughts, Cantor Torney?
I have a source for us that Rabbi Reuven Hammer, Zichrono Livracha, was an incredible resource and a great Syracusean. I'm also a former head of the Rabbinical Assembly. I recommend all of his commentaries on liturgy and more. He, in his commentary, he notes that already in Ta'anit, if you want to look into the Bavli, into the Babylonian Talmud, already in Masechet Ta'anit, we had the invention of chatzi Hallel, of the half Hallel, this idea that we have a festive Hallel that's diminished on certain days when Hallel was not said in the temple, reinforcing the fact that Hallel was indeed said in the construct that we know it in temple times, or at least there was a presumption that there was a Hallel said in this construct in temple times. So it is as ancient as my brain was telling me I remembered it was, but a nice confirmation by Rabbi Reuven Hammer that construct is indeed as ancient as the temple.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on what's striking to you in these differences, similarities, Joanna? I have to unmute you.
It's interesting to me, like, that we have an opportunity for Pesach Sheni, but not for a lot of other things Sheni. Like there's no Bikurim Sheni or pick your mitzvah Sheni. And so then the question why, and a lot of what I'm thinking about this really, through the lens of, living through COVID, like I wonder if, we would come to the same conclusions, not in these times. But I'm thinking that part of what's going on here, perhaps, is somewhat similar to what's taken place in this community vis-a-vis Mourner's Kaddish, that while we don't rank mitzvot or say certain mitzvot are more important, the reality is that certain mitzvot touch the heart of people more than others do. And so then therefore, Pesach, like if you think to our own day, having a Pesach Seder in some form is one of the most observed rituals in Judaism. So that once we acknowledge that there was a group of people for whom observing Pesach would be incredibly difficult, when we provide that alternate opportunity, we're going to do it in a way that really makes it accessible because we're acknowledging the difficulty of the times. So, in 2019, no one might have thought of having Zoom services or saying, oh yeah, mourner can chime in from afar to say Mourner's Kaddish. But when we hit a situation realizing the difficulty, certain decisions were made to say, we have to enable the people to feel that connection and to maintain that connection.
Absolutely. And I think that that's spot on, citing, like while there's no literal ranking, how do these function in the lives of the people performing these mitzvot? And, it's like the Pew study agrees with what you're saying, that like even more than people who go to, I haven't actually read the most recent one, but the last one that I read, at least, even more than people who go to shul on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, there's widespread participation in a Passover Seder in some form. And so, we could talk more about why that might be, the communal narratives, freedom, it being, trendy even with secular culture today. But, so like, I think that's a really great point, that particular mitzvah might have held, significance even through the ages. Yes, we're looking at it from that lens today, but I think it has a unique kind of staying power that may have been, have been felt through the generations. So thank you for that. Other thoughts? So just to think back to kind of my opening thought about what's worth redoing and what's worth, kind of accepting that the first version of it was imperfect or different during COVID. I think that the the description of Pesach Sheni offers kind of both paradigms as valid, that especially in the example I described, though didn't get on the source sheet, of Rambam saying, when the majority of people have faced something significant that would make them ritually impure, you do actually band together and those people can participate the first time, which I see as more kind of parallel to, okay, we're having, the Zoom bar mitzvah and it's different than have expected, but we're going forward. And then there's also the other cases of saying, no, sometimes people couldn't do it the first time. We're making this other, second round thing that's at a different time, also is, imperfect and different in some way, and isn't quite as special maybe, or it doesn't have all of the unique elements of the first time. And yet it's still considered a positive mitzvah. It's still considered to have the same weight for the people who are doing that. So I at least from where I'm sitting in these still kind of strange times that we find ourselves in, I'm seeing the laws of Pesach Sheni speak to those both being really like important and true and valid ways of moving forward when rituals arrive at times when things may not be exactly as you expect. So I hope for any of you, if you're facing choices like that, if you know people who are facing choices like that, that we will be able to hold on to the significance in whatever ways those moments have arrived in our lives in this past year and a half and and the months ahead. So thank you all for learning together tonight, and we will continue with our Mariv service, which begins on page 264 in Lev Shalem, 281 in Slim Shalom, or 200 in the full Sim Shalom. והוא רחום יכפר עוון ולא ישחית, והרבה להשיבה פה ולא יאיר כל חמתו, אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו ביום קוראנו. ברוך אתה אדוני כל האנשים. ומעביר יום ומביא לילה, ומבדיל בין יום ובין לילה, אדוני צבאות שמו. אל חי וקיים, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, המעריב הרבים. אהבת עולם בית ישראל אחריו. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל, אל מלך נאמן. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם. אמת ואמונה כל זאת וקיימת. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם, משה ובני ישראל לחנו שירה, בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה. מלכותך ראו בניך בוקע ים לפני משה, זה אלינו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גל ישראל. Hashkivenu on page 267, 284, or 206. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom. Ushmor tzeitenu voenu l'chaim u'l'shalom me'ata ve'ad olam. Baruch ata Adonai, shomer amo Yisrael ad. Ki ha-malchut shelcha hi u'la'olamei ad timloch b'chavod, ki ein lanu melech ela ata. Baruch ata Adonai melech b'chodo tamid yimloch alenu l'olam va'ed ve'al kol ma'asav. We will now begin our whispered Amidah on pages 270, 286, or 210. And just remember to add in the conclusion of Shabbat additions. Ose shalom bimromav, Ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'imru, imru, amen. Yanananai, 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 yanananai. If you are still davening, please continue at your own pace. We will continue with the concluding sections at the end of Shabbat. So just skip Chatzi Kaddish if you're in Lev Shalem or Sim Shalom, and we will jump to page 684 if you are in the regular Sim Shalom. Vihi Noam Adonai Eloheinu Aleinu Uma'aseh Yadenu Konana Aleinu Uma'aseh Yadenu Konanehu. Yikra'eni ve'enehu imo anochi v'tzara achaltzehu ve'achabdehu orech yamim ashbiyehu ve'arehu bishuati orech yamim ashbiyehu ve'arehu bishuati ve'ata kadosh yoshev tzilot Yisrael v'kar azeh al zeh v'amar. V'tiza'eni ruach ve'eshma acharai kol rash gadol Baruch kavod Adonai mimkomo. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. ויבטחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה וידיר. We will go to Aleinu on 281, 297, or 696. Aleinu לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת קדומה ליוצר ראשית, שלא עשנו פיגועי רצון, ולא זמנו כשפות אדוני. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Mourners Kaddish. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. So am I correct that we are still a few minutes early for Havdalah? Okay, so we can do some singing, or if anybody had additional thoughts about the teaching come up, we can, continue the conversation. Yeah, Brant? Right, I have to unmute you again. Sorry about that.
I was going to say that one of my law partners this week went to a graduation at USC for his daughter who graduated last year. And they had both of the graduations together. So last year and this year, all at the Coliseum in a stadium. So I'm just saying, as I just went through this last week where they changed everything so that the kids could come back. And I imagine it was a little bit different.
Right.
I imagine that it was meaningful to the parents.
Exactly. Yes and yes. I mean, the Ziegler ordination, for example, they ordained a class of rabbis last year in what was mostly a Zoom experience, though I think the actual giving of their degrees, they still did in person, but masked. I don't think they were like touching each other with the usual hand situation. But they're in this year's service, they're also honoring last year's graduates. And, many of the rabbinical schools that I know about are doing something similar where it's the ordination class of 2021, but a ceremony celebrating the ordination classes of 2020 and 2021. So yeah, like there are people who probably felt like they, I hope that they still feel like rabbis by now, but they, missed a part of that experience. Do people know of other examples? I mean, I know plenty of people whose like wedding plans keep getting changed, postponed, whatever. And, a handful of them just decided to, like get legally married somehow or another during COVID. And then they're going to have a party that might be even like a year delayed when they can gather with people. And it's still calibrating. Okay, do we have a party now when I can invite 100 people? When I really wanted to invite 400 people? Kind of like how that's almost like a Pesach, Sheni, Shlishi. They're like waiting to see exactly how delayed they want it to be.
I know that for a lot of people, it's been a particularly big divide between those things that can be postponed and feel like they're still they're evergreen. You can really delay that. You can do a graduation sheni, and you can do a wedding sheni even though the marriage might not be new, because a renewal of vows is still a concept we have in our culture. There are lots of b'nai mitzvah who are resistant to having their celebrations of their studies delayed, even when we've made ritual stretches. They just don't have interest in doing the thing they always pictured it as doing it at 12 and 13 at the age of 14 or older. And the same is true around death and rituals. People are really struggling with what to do around loss at this time. The unveilings seem to lack the potency of a funeral. And I'm struggling. I think a lot of people are struggling to empower people to get back those moments that were really lost. And aren't evergreen, and try to add power to the ones that can be recaptured, because there are a lot that can be recaptured, and there are some that are just going to have been lost to the time of COVID.
Right. I appreciate your perspective on that, because you're seeing it really on the ground in so many ways with all the different life cycle events, and I imagine that especially for the ones that involve digging back into painful places, that it's just, even if there's a piece that's unprocessed, it's a hard ask of someone to say, oh no, I think it's actually going to be really meaningful for you to try and, reassemble the kind of experience you might have had a year ago to like mark this time of pain in your life. So it's really, right, it becomes like part of the losses of this time. Brant, I'm going to unmute you. Okay.
Yeah, but we have to admit that some things are better. See, that's the rub. I mean, like, so I went to a memorial service on Zoom, and there's no way that all these people would have come to the actual funeral from like the East Coast and the Deep South, and where there are Diverns all over the United States that showed up at this thing that I'd never met on Zoom. I would never know Joanna if it wasn't for the COVID virus, you know, and people that show up on our Zoom. So in some respects, the change has been beneficial, and in other respects, it, you know, there, and you know, it's like half a loaf. So it's kind of interesting to me to think about it in terms of the good and the bad, and that's why I think in the long run we're going to enjoying some hybrid of this for a while. It's going to be a long time because people are getting used to going to services in New York and California, and people in Toronto coming to services in Los Angeles. See.
Right. I mean, I like, just for context to people, you know, probably don't know all of the details. A large part of why we're in Chicago right now is because my mom has cancer that is bad. And like, we would have had to make, you know, harder decisions about, you know, if I had to do everything in LA, like, you know, we're now kind of having to make some of those hard decisions just to bear a little bit of my, like, what's going on behind the scenes for us to you all here. But like, you know, it enabled us to do a lot. Like, I can be speaking to you right now because of the divide. And, you know, again, to kind of bring back the what was different about Pesach Sheni experience, like, it didn't have all of the specific pieces that may feel special. I don't get to see all of you in person, even though now things are opening back up again. And it's like allowed for a degree of inclusion for folks who, you know, for a variety of reasons might not, you know, have been able to come to this, that, or the other. So, you know, I think I really hope, Brant, that you're right, that this hybrid thing is going to be something that sticks with us for to hold on to all of the good pieces as much as we can. All right, I think we can now go to Havdalah, and it looks like we have at least one enthusiastic additional participant. Hello, hello. All right. הנה על ישועתי אבטח ולא אחד, כי עוזי וזמרת יד אדוני ויהי לי לישועה, ושבתם מים בששון מן מעייני הישועה, לאדוני הישועה. על עמך ברכתך סלע, אדוני צבאות עמנו. משכב לנו אלוהי יעקב סלע, אדוני צבאות. אשרי אדם בוטח בך, אדוני הושיע. המלך יעננו ביום קוראנו ליהודים. הייתה אורה בשמחה וששון בעיקר, כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועות אשא, ובשם אדוני אקרא. יאי ניי 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 ניי. Carefully adjust my materials here. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei minei Samim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei meorei ha'esh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechoshech ben Yisrael le'amim ben yom hashvi'i לששת ימי המעשה. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לחול. שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב. שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב. אליהו הנביא, אליהו התשבי, אליהו, אליהו, אליהו הגלעדי, במהרה בימינו יבוא אלינו. עם משיח בן דוד, עם משיח בן דוד. Wishing you all a very sweet week. It's been a pleasure being together with you all tonight. Nice to see everyone. Shavua tov, Laila tov. Take care.